The value of balance in our society and our political system. Humans are complex, and societies we live in even more so. If the needs and aspirations of some are given overwhelming weight over others, then resentment and discord are the result. In my view then, one of the core tasks of government is to ensure that balance is maintained, a fair balance of interests, power and resources, recognising that an imbalance in any of these areas privileges some and inhibits others from achieving their potential, and that such injustice will hurt us all in the end. And so balance has always been a thing that I've thought about in the areas for which I have responsibility, including the immigration system. I came into the immigration role in June of this year, and that was right at the point that two things effectively happened. The first is that, well, from July anyway, New Zealand's borders began to reopen after the unprecedented experience of them more or less being closed for 2 years during COVID. We've never previously in our history, former MP Mahesh Bindra, who's here as well. Sorry to forget you, Mahesh, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
We've never before in our history had the experience of closing our borders and then reopening them. And that has been a very challenging experience for a lot of people, everyone who plays a part in the immigration system. So that happened as of July, and also from about that point onwards, the government moved forward with its immigration rebalance, which is our attempt to deal with what we saw as some of the imbalances that had built up in the system over quite a long period of time. So we had two very big things happening. You usually only do one of those things at once if you had to, pretty much at the same time. And so if you're involved in the immigration system and you feel like it's been a really big 6 or 7 months that we've just come through, that is because it has been an unprecedented time of change right across the system. Now, our government moved ahead with the immigration rebalance, axiomatically, because we thought that there were some imbalances in the system that needed to change. And I just want to speak to a few of those, and then I'll talk about some of the things that we've done to try and create a greater balance. The graph that you see before you speaks to the way that the number of temporary visas issued within New Zealand increased at a very high rate over the 10-year period between about 2007, 2008 and 2017, 2018. Immigration has always been one of the lifebloods of New Zealand. It always has been, it always will be. It's a source of enormous human capital and potential, particularly for a small country like New Zealand. But our view is that we got to a point in the period before 2017, 2018, where particularly in some sectors, we had as a country become extremely reliant on some of the highest levels of short-term visa issuance of any country in the world, particularly in some sectors that had a high focus on low skills and low wages. And some of the impacts of that were that firstly, that we were extremely vulnerable. So if you look at that graph, you see numbers building up quite steeply over that period. And as I say, by that time, around about 5% of people in the New Zealand workforce were here on a short-term work visa, the highest rate in the world. And then, of course, the border shutdown came. And of course, no one could have predicted that. But the very, very high reliance we had, particularly in some sectors where rates are up and around about 30%, hospitality, parts of retail. But when the crunch came and things changed dramatically as they can in our topsy-turvy world, we were extremely vulnerable at that time, and that played out in a range of ways. The fact that much of that short-term immigration up until that point had been highly focused on quite a low-wage, low-skill sector of the economy wasn't the only factor, but it was one of the factors in the struggle that New Zealand has had to really build a high-wage, high-skill, high-productivity economy and society. Basically, for 30 or 40 years, we haven't been building up the level of skills and productivity in our economy that we really need if we want to be a truly prosperous country. And our view is that one of the contributors to that is that in some sectors, instead of making those investments domestically, we were giving some employers a relatively easy route to low-wage, low-skill labour that wasn't building the kind of productive economy that we need. And then at the very worst end of that, we experienced high levels of exploitation in parts of our labour market as well. And some of you will have seen those stories that continue to come through. We've had rates of migrant exploitation in the New Zealand labour market that none of us should feel satisfied with. And I think that for too long, actually, that's been brushed under the carpet at the political level, the business level, and sometimes at the community level. And so one of the things that our government has been really focused on in the rebalance is making sure that we bring in the changes and the policies and the transparency to ensure that if someone from another part of the world comes here to give their labour in New Zealand, that we treat them with dignity and respect, and that they shouldn't be exploited and taken advantage of. That's bad for New Zealand, it's bad for that person, it's not in keeping with our values. And so as we came with that rebalance, those were some of the imbalances that we were trying to address. Broadly speaking, there were three things that we were trying to balance within the rebalance. Firstly, and most importantly, are the mid to long-term needs of New Zealand. And you use that term, Venkat, in the topic for this address of human capital. But really what we're talking about there are the talents, the abilities, the skills that migrants bring to New Zealand that are so critical for how we build our country and develop a prosperous future for everyone. So we need a system that really hones in on the skills that we need in the medium and long term and makes New Zealand an attractive place for people to come and settle and contribute. So many people have, including many people in this room. There are also short to medium term needs of business that we need to satisfy. And this is one of those areas where there is a challenging balance that comes into it. Because in an era in which internationally we do face labour shortages, there is a constant and understandable pressure from the business sector to fill those short-term shortages. And to some degree we do need to provide that support. But our view is at the same time we need to keep the positive pressure on to make sure that the skills and the wages are being invested in so that we build up a sustainable domestic workforce as well. And then the third key pillar in that balance that we try to strike is a balance around the rights and duties of migrants themselves. And that comes down to those things that I was talking about before. The fact that if someone comes and settles in New Zealand and contributes, they shouldn't expect exploitation, they should have clear rights. And the pathways that are open to them, or not open to them, should be very, very transparent. We should be clear and open and honest with people who come to work in New Zealand as to whether there are residency pathways and people can begin to invest and move down that pathway, or whether this is a shorter term arrangement, as will sometimes be the case and has always been the case. And so our rebalance was aimed at trying to get the balance between each of those things right. And I'll say this really clearly, it's something I strongly believe in politics. You weigh up those complex factors which involve how an economy is structured, the vision we have for our society, the needs and the aspirations of individuals and their families. It's a complex brew. There's no simple answer. We need to work through those questions and those tensions and those balances maturely. We need to ask ourselves the question, we need to be open to listening to criticism and different ideas and be willing to adjust if the balance isn't quite working out in the right way. And that's the way that we try and take things forward. When I came into the role in July, there were four things that I said I would do to try and make sure that we achieved a balance across the system. First was to spend time on the ground listening. The second was to implement the rebalance itself. The third was to deal with a range of significant outstanding policy issues that have been sitting around for a while. And the fourth was then to move on to some of the bigger long-term questions about our immigration system. We're at a point now where we've largely worked through the first of those three things, and we're moving on to some of the bigger, longer-term settings. And I want to briefly talk through each of those phases first. The first was that phase of listening, just getting out on the ground, meeting with people from migrant communities, the immigration sector of professionals itself, listening to policy advice and conflicting views sometimes, to try and build my base of knowledge about the issues and the different solutions. A number of you have really helped me with that. I've been able to sit down with you in group settings or one-on-one and pick your brains about what's working, what's not working, and what you think we might want to consider. And I really want to thank people for that. Critically for me, that's been a wide-ranging exercise, listening to business interests, listening to workers, listening to unions, listening to advisors, listening to lawyers, and all of the professional organisations. And the general population always has views about immigration as well. And I've stood in rooms with a couple of hundred people, or a group of people on this side have passionately advocated for one particular thing and said, you must be crazy if you don't believe what I'm saying. And a group of people on the other side have stood up and said exactly the opposite. and immigration is a little bit like that, coming back to that importance of trying to strike a good balance. So a lot of listening at the outset. Then moving on to implementing the rebalance. And this was enormously important because, as I said, we were basically putting this new system in place with new rules, new visa products, new processes, new things to get used to, at the same time as the country was reopening up after 2 years of closure. So that was really challenging, and my view was that in the last 6 months of last year, one of the most important things for me in the government was to get rules and get visa processes in place, and that sometimes take getting used to, but they needed to be in place. We needed to get the system moving so that we could give people that certainty and start accessing the international labour market that we so very much need in New Zealand. And so that has been an enormously busy period, and it's involved addressing a lot of policies, which I'll touch on at the moment. The key things that we've tried to achieve through that rebalance are a system that's fair, a system that builds our productivity, as I said before, and a system that people can have confidence in. The fairness one I just want to come back to. So over the last year, we've put a huge amount of effort into making sure that migrants are treated with respect, and we stamp out exploitation. So as part of that rebalance, I've said to our officials in the Labour Inspectorate and Immigration, you have licence to go after the bad guys and take them through the courts. We want them out. And so you will see, and will have seen over recent months, a consistent number of cases coming through where our teams have been enforcing the very worst cases where people have been exploited, abused and taken advantage of. I want to actually do a shout out to someone in this room, and I can't see where he's sitting. Dinesh Kadkar, one of our, hello Dinesh, leaders from our Nepalese community, is one of our community leaders who has stood up and supported workers from his own community who have experienced exploitation. That's something that's really hard to do when it's happening within your own community. But Dinesh stood up for what was right. And one of the messages that I consistently put out in these addresses is to call on all community leaders to take a stand against exploitation. If you're worried about something, if you hear something, if something doesn't feel right, talk to the authorities and we'll give support and investigate where necessary. We've backed that up with hard measures, a new migrant exploitation visa that gives people a safe haven if they're experiencing exploitation. New powers for the Immigration Inspectorate, Immigration and the Labour Inspectorate to work together, an 0800 number to report exploitation, and new legislation that Priyanka Radhakrishnan is taking through the House to strengthen our provisions and to stop bad employers from being able to re-employ people back into the labour market. Beyond that, it's just been an enormously busy period. We've established the accredited employer work visa, the main short-term visa, work visa for people to come into New Zealand and work for up to 3 years. Under that scheme, we've approved 150,000 job checks for employers to be able to recruit and approved around about 40,000 people to enter New Zealand. We've set up the green list system to give prioritised access to those professions that we need the most in New Zealand with a 2-year or straight to residency pathway. We've expanded significantly the working holiday visa scheme with extensions to that scheme and increases to a number of the CAT schemes, and approved around about 50,000 working holiday makers to come into New Zealand. We put in place a record increase to RSE numbers, increasing from 16,000 to 19,000 to help out our horticulture sector and growers. We've implemented sector agreements to give some targeted sectors who are not able to meet the median wage requirements a bit more flexibility and some encouragement to invest in skills and training. We've got the SMC, the skilled migrant category, the main residency pathway reopened, and with a major policy revamp there to make it more targeted and simplified for people to use. And I was also thrilled, as was mentioned earlier, to get the parent category reopened. In my view, we've had 5 years in which people have had an uncertainty about whether there's a pathway to be able to settle parents in New Zealand, and that needed to be resolved. So that was a top priority, and it was good to get that in place. At the same time, we've worked on balancing out the economic side of the immigration system with the humanitarian side. And so in 2022-2023, for the first time, we've now increased our refugee quota from 1,000 to 1,500 people, taking people in from some of the most difficult and conflict-strewn parts of the world. Increased the family reunification quota from 300 people to 600 people a year, so that former refugees can bring their families in to settle, and provided significant additional support in situations like Afghanistan, Syria and Ukraine for people to be able to seek shelter or to settle into New Zealand as well. So that's another part of the balance in the system. We often talk about the economic side, but New Zealand has always been very strong in our immigration, having a strong humanitarian side, because that aligns with our values and our place in the world. One of the biggest successes in immigration this year, and a key part of the rebalance and getting that balance right, and recognising that human capital and talent that we want to keep here in New Zealand, has been the 2021 resident visa policy. This graph is a really interesting one behind you here. It shows year on year for about 10 years the numbers of people that we have issued residency visas to in New Zealand. The jump you see from last year is resident visa 2021. And so what you can see there is that there has never been a time in our more recent history where we have provided more direct and simple pathways for large numbers of migrants who are settled and contributing in New Zealand to be able to make this place their permanent home and to be able to settle well here. We had about 220,000 people who applied for RV21, and as of yesterday, around about 76% of applications have been approved. We'd aim to resolve about 80% by June, so we're ahead of target there and making really good progress. You'll probably know some people who might still be waiting on their application. They are making their way through at the rate of around about 1,500 people per week. So do just hang in there, we're making good progress. And as you can see, this has been an enormously successful program and a really important part of getting that balance right. And I just want to emphasise that. In parts of the system, we have made changes which lift the bar a little bit. We don't apologise for that. Putting a median wage threshold in place and a labour market threshold in place are about putting positive pressure in the system so that we develop our human capital in New Zealand. But at the same time, we're balancing that with policies like RV21, the parent category SMC, to make sure that we do get that access to human capital and talent from all around the world, which is so important in New Zealand. I also want to make two announcements this evening, which speak to another step in trying to get the balance right. When we announced the immigration rebalance in mid-2022, we announced changes to partner work rights. And the theory was pretty simple, that if most people coming in on short-term work visas into New Zealand had to get an accredited employer work visa, the same should apply to the partner. If we're putting that policy in place for one, it made sense to do it for the other. During my time in the role since July, I've been on the ground and listening, and people have raised concerns with me about what some of the implications of that policy might be. And the two concerns broadly expressed were, firstly, that in doing so, we might create a lesser level of independence for some partners, which might make them more vulnerable if they are experiencing situations of domestic violence. And secondly, a concern that in doing so, even though there might be good policy reasons, we might just be creating a bit more friction in the system, and that might be off-putting for some people with great talents wanting to settle into New Zealand, because what it effectively means is that partner would have to get a visa before they came to New Zealand, and that might just be seen as another barrier in a competitive international market. So I want to announce two clarifications, two changes that we're making to that policy in response to the feedback. The first is that we will be taking important steps to ensure that the immigration system supports partners of migrant workers impacted by family violence. And what I will confirm, therefore, is that the government will be protecting victims of family violence through changes to the victims of family violence visas. As of tomorrow, that's the 28th of February, we'll be expanding access to the victims of family violence work visa to all people who are on partner-based visas that are linked to a temporary migrant. Currently, access to that visa is mainly for people who are the partner of a New Zealand resident or citizen. This change will make that access to that visa and that protection available across large parts of our migrant community. A victim of family violence work visa enables eligible migrants to obtain a 6-month open work visa independent of their partner. Immigration settings never cause family violence, but this change will reduce the ability for a victim to be controlled through the circumstances of their visa. This announcement will just be a first step, and there's further work planned which will consider changes to settings to better support migrant victims of family violence. Further work will look at immigration settings and also wider support settings for victims, migrant victims of family violence. That work will start in the second quarter of 2023. The second change that I want to announce relates to our partner work rights through our immigration system. From the 31st of May 2023, partners of most temporary migrant workers who are applying for a new partnership-based work visa will be required to work for an accredited employer. They can work in almost any role provided they are paid at or above the wage threshold that applies to their job, which is usually that median wage. Change will apply to most partners of essential skills and accredited employer work visa holders. These partners will be able to apply for a partner of a work visa. They will not need to have a job or a job offer to apply. So the change that we have made there for partners of people with work visas is that instead of having to get the full accredited employer work visa and have a job visa, they will effectively have a special type of visa with open work rights that does not have to go through the labour market test. So they will be able to get that visa and have much more security about their ability to undertake work in New Zealand at a good standard. So this is part of the balance that we are trying to achieve, putting better standards in place, but also looking to take friction out of the system where that might reduce our access to human capital and skills from people who want to work in New Zealand. It's important to note that partners with existing work visas won't be affected by that change. Their existing arrangements will continue. This change will just apply to new visa applications. Partners of New Zealanders and partners of people working in a green list occupation will also continue to have open work rights. Change in a nutshell will mean that partners will be able to get a visa with work rights attached from offshore much more easily, offering greater certainty to them and their family. They'll also be able to change jobs without having to engage with Immigration New Zealand, which had been a concern expressed about the previous settings. So it will be a much more streamlined process. I want to briefly finish by talking about some of the work ahead as we look to strike that balance within our immigration system. There are three important things to be aware about the immigration program for 2023. The first is that, as we have signalled, we're moving forward with work on the migrant and refugee resettlement strategy. This is a central strategy and document for how we support migrants and refugees in New Zealand to settle well, to be able to contribute and to have their well-being looked after. That strategy has been the subject of significant consultation in the latter part of 2022, and we'll be looking to get a draft document out there for a final round of consultation in the coming month or two. The second piece is that we will be looking to move forward with a broader review of family and partnership settings. And this includes a wide range of areas, including the aforementioned area of family violence and more support that we can provide there, dealing with issues relating to cultural marriage, which are often an area of tension within the system as deeply personal circumstances have to make their way through a bureaucratic system. We want to work out better ways of dealing with that. So that review of family and partnership settings will take place in stages starting in the second quarter of 2023. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, we received an excellent report from Ganesh Nana of the Productivity Commission in late 2021, which laid down a number of questions and issues about the immigration system. Cabinet will formally be responding to that in the next couple of months, and I want to indicate a couple of the key areas that I think are worthy of further exploration. The first were a set of questions and issues that he raised about the relationship of our immigration system with Māori in New Zealand. It's not an issue that we've ever really dealt with within the immigration system, and Māori's tangata whenua have consistently advocated to have more of a role in shaping how New Zealand works and how our immigration system might function. So that is something that we want to work through with all parties around the table. Secondly, one of the recommendations of Ganesh Nana was the establishment of a government policy statement or a GPS for immigration. Now, GPS is a document that we use in government in a range of areas, including transport, to provide greater certainty and transparency over a number of years about the direction of policy. And one of the critiques over a long period of time that people have had about the immigration system is it can feel a bit choppy and changey, and that can make it difficult for people, businesses and communities to plan and have certainty. Now, sometimes governments will need to respond to the circumstances of the day, but I do believe that a document like a GPS that says, here's our plan for the next 10 years, and here's how we're going to work that through over the next 3 years, and provide some real certainty about the direction, could be a really useful document to helping us strike that balance, having good open public debates, and enable people to plan with more certainty. So the government will be putting forward its formal response in the next 1 to 2 months to the Productivity Commission, and those are some of the areas that we will be very interested in working through. I want to finish with a quote
That's from Albert Einstein. He said, "Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving." Within the immigration system in New Zealand, we make something like 1.5 million individual decisions every single year. It is an enormously complex system. It has to be rules-based by nature to be fair to each person, but then has to deal with people as individuals with their own unique circumstances. So it's complicated and it's difficult, but it does have to keep moving. The way that we will try and ensure that we do keep balance within the system to make the most of the human capital, the skills and the abilities that people have to offer New Zealand is to make sure that we keep listening, that we keep focused on those values, and that we keep supporting migrants who want to make New Zealand a place in which they work, live and contribute. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time this evening. I love this job, the challenges and the opportunities and the place that it plays in New Zealand economy and society, and I look forward to further questions and discussion as the night proceeds. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.